On behalf of the President of the IAS Association and all the service members, retired and serving, I take this opportunity to welcome all of you. Today amidst us, we have an eminent person, Mr. Nandan Nilekani. I think all of you are familiar with Mr. Nandan Nilekani, but nevertheless, I would like to say a few words about him. We are all proud of him, sir, as people from Bangalore and from Karnataka, that you are from Karnataka and Bangalore. It's indeed a great pride for us. We all know him as a successful entrepreneur, a thinker, somebody who's gone beyond thinking and has engaged with social development, and a major philanthropist. So we are very proud of you. Briefly, Mr. Nandan Nilekani, after he completed his graduation in IIT Mumbai, he joined in 1978 in Patni Computer Systems, where he met Mr. Narayan Murthy. That was in 78. Then, as you all know, that in 1981, few of them left Patni and co-founded the Infosys, and the rest is history. After that, Mr. Nandan Nilekani continued in Infosys till 2007. From 2002 to 2007, he was the CEO of Infosys. He rose up to the CEO level there. Now, the interesting thing about Mr. Nilekani is, while he was growing in Infosys, his horizons also expanded, and he continuously kept working towards engaging with society, which was new for those days for the corporate sector to engage in a serious manner. And it was, again, Mr. Nandan's initiative during those days that he conceived the Bangalore Agenda Task Force. And as you know, it was a very successful and a very unique experiment. And it was not just an experiment, actually. He engaged, and the BATF engaged with the civic agencies of Bangalore. It was very unique because they were simultaneously engaging with 5-6 entities of the government on one side and the citizens on the other, along with the private sector. So Nandan conceived this wonderful new model of PPP, and he got the right people on it. And not only that, he chaired it and he held it very closely, monitoring it all the time. And I would also like to mention that he funded the entire BATF's operations during the entire 4 to 5 years that BATF engaged with Bangalore, including the office expenses, the administrative expenses, the consultants' fees, training, everything, software development, everything. In fact, they also implemented pilots at their own cost. This was one of the first experiments ever in the country, and it was a very successful model. We thank Mr. Nandan Nilekani for that. His engagement with the social development and with government didn't end there, and he continued in various forms working with social issues, and subsequently he joined as chairman of the Unique Identification Authority of India in 2009 on invitation of the then Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh. And as you all know, Aadhaar has become one of the important pieces of development today, and there's a tremendous potential on how we can build further on Aadhaar. Mr. Nilekani will be speaking to all of us shortly on his experience in Aadhaar and the potential that Aadhaar has unleashed. Currently, Mr. Nilekani is also the president of the NCAER, which is an economic think tank in India, and he's also part of the World Economic Forum Foundation and the Bombay Heritage Fund. Mr. Nilekani has several honors to his credit, awards and honors. I would like to mention only a few. As early as in 2005, he was awarded the Joseph Schumpeter Prize for innovative services in economy, economic sciences and politics. And I think he has straddled all of them, economic services and politics. In 2006, Mr. Nilekani became the youngest entrepreneur to join 20 global leaders on the World Economic Forum Foundation board. Again, in 2006, he was awarded the Padma Bhushan, which is one of the highest civilian awards. Again, in 2006, he was named Businessman of the Year by Forbes Asia. In 2009, Time magazine placed Mr. Nilekani in the Times 100 list of world's most influential people. He was also presented the Legend in Leadership Award by the Yale University in November 2009. He's the first Indian to receive the top honor. He received the NDTV Indian of the Year's Transformational Idea of the Year award in 2011 for Aadhaar. I think Nandan is now saying, stop it, stop it. He's also a very popular author of 2 books, which have been placed here for people who are interested. The first book was in 2009, Imagining India, the Idea of Renewed Nation. And then the second one is 2015, a recent book which he co-authored along with Mr. Shah, Rebooting India, Realizing a Billion Aspirations, And I'm happy to say that both the books have been received very, very well, cutting across spectrum in society. Lastly, I would like to mention a word that Mr. Nandan Nilekani's recent reports say that he's the second largest philanthropist in India, and it is indeed creditable. Mr. Nilekani and his Rohini and Nandan both have been doing this in various ways, in various sectors also. Rohini has, of course, been involved in water management for a long time through Argyam, and Nandan has in different hats. Currently, apart from all the earlier philanthropic work they have done and been doing, both Nandan and Rohini have now started Ekstep, which is an interesting not-for-profit literacy and numeracy platform, where they have set it up with an initial corpus of some $10 million, and it looks at solving the learning problem by creating a technology-led platform to help children to improve their learning outcomes quite early in their life. So it's coming together of technology, of pedagogy, and various other things, and using gaming technology and mobiles to make it easier. So it's a new age thing, and we are expecting a lot to come out of Ekstep. So now I request you to kindly address our gathering.
I think Prasad's introduction is longer than my speech. Thanks, Prasad. It's really great to be here at the ARI. I'm going to do this presentation in two parts. I thought I'll first talk about how we did it, and then I'll talk about what we did. Because how we did it is as important as what we did, and navigating, Delhi, Shelley, and all that. So you have to. So I think when the Prime Minister asked me to work on this project, it was a very big idea that, give 1 billion people an ID. And it took me about 3-4 weeks before I sort of said, okay, this is a problem that can be solved. And so I accepted the assignment. I was very fortunate because the UID authority had been approved by the cabinet in January of 2009, and or rather the initial approval, and the final approval came up to the cabinet on June 26th. And it was interesting because the proposal was a very, very solid proposal, and it involved setting up an organization of 1,400 employees and had, as you'll appreciate, 36 joint secretaries in that organization. It's going to become bigger than the Election Commission or the Finance Ministry or certainly the Home Ministry. But when I looked at that, I felt that this was not really a project where you required a lot of people. I wanted to do it with a small team. So I unilaterally reduced the JSS from 36 to 12, which was a big shock to everyone. Who's this guy who's reducing the number of joint secretaries that he wants? But anyway, we said we'll do it in a very small way. I was very lucky that at least in initial days, I was able to select a team to do the project. After some time, they stopped giving me any selection. I had to go by whatever DOPT told me to do. But at least for the first 6 months, I had some choice. So I essentially scanned the entire system, looking for officers who would be good for this task. I was very lucky. Somebody said there's this guy in Jharkhand called Ram Sevak Sharma. And I checked his background. Very interesting guy. He's from a village near Agra. Didn't know English till he came to Allahabad University. Did his master's in computer science from IIT Kanpur and was a programmer at heart. So he had done, and of course when I went to the CAPSEC, he said Jharkhand, he just woke up because Jharkhand at that time was having this huge, all these kinds of scams and all. Jharkhand. And I said, don't worry, he's a good guy from Jharkhand. So I talked to him and he said, I'll be happy to join, which was a good thing. Then I was very lucky for my PS, I got Srikar from Karnataka. Again, he had happened to be the DC in Dharwad, which is my hometown. So I checked with a few friends, they said he's a good guy. So Srikar became my PS and so on. So I assembled a team of guys. So I think at least in the first 6 months, I could select about 10 of the key people in the team, which was a very important requirement because in government, as you know, you can't choose whom you want. So I was able to choose. So at least the first core team of people I personally handpicked and interviewed. The second thing I made sure was that that they came from very diverse services because I felt that I wanted to get the full, the full flavor of the diversity in the bureaucracy. So while, of course, a lot of the key people were from the IAS, the CFO is a lady called Ganga who was from the Audit and Account Service. a top guy who did the financial inclusion from the Indian Postal Service, and a lot of people from the Defense Account Service, which I found a solid service. They knew all their stuff. So I made sure that the people were selected from my PS after Srika was from the police service. So I went across all these services and tried to create a heterogeneous group of people because I wanted diversity in the team. The other thing was that we realized that a project of this technological complexity could simply not be done purely within the government because it required some very advanced kind of things which the expertise would not be there. So we put together a team of private sector people who would complement this. And I was able to attract a very high quality talent from the private sector. And we had to find a way. The two things I realized in the government is you can't spend money and you can't hire the people that you want. So it's difficult to do anything if you can't spend money and you can't hire the people that you want. So we came up with 4 models of getting talent into the system. The first was we actually hired people through a route where we could bring technology people into the government. So we had a lot of people that way. Second, we had a scheme of people coming on sabbatical. So we got again, and all this, everything done through process, cabinet approval, EFC approval, you name it, everything was done properly. So second was we got people come on sabbatical. So we got people to come on work on deputation from companies for a couple of years. So we were able to get good talent like that. The third, we had a big internship program. And the fourth thing which we did was we got a lot of volunteers who came free because many of them had become very successful in their lives and were looking for something meaningful to do. So I still have a lot of volunteers who didn't come for the money, but the chance to work on something that was nationally significant. I had one guy called Raj Mashruwala who were semi-retired in Silicon Valley. He came and spent 1.5 years in Bangalore, helping us build this, and many people like that. The other thing which we did was that while we had the administrative office in Delhi, we kept the technology office in Bangalore because I didn't want them to be in Delhi, to be honest, because I didn't want too much of meddling, scheduling and all that. So I said, is there a way to sort of shield them from that stuff? So we set up the tech office on Outer Ring Road. And if you came to the tech office, it looked like any other tech office in Bangalore. It didn't look like, it was very informal and all that. So we deliberately kept the technology center here because we wanted the technology to happen here because it required, unbothered thing. But we would do reviews every 2-3 weeks. We would fly down to Bangalore and do these reviews. So these are some of the things. We also designed the system to be designing for scale because what we realized was that if we had to get, one of the things I'd learned from the BATF experience is that how it's important to make these things sustainable. Sustainability is very important because there are lots of things people do and then when they get transferred or they leave or the political winds change, then those things just get, they get dropped. So that's the nature of things that we do. So when we looked at this, we said we were very clear that this should be sustainable across political transition. And the best way to make it sustainable was to make it so large that nobody could shut it down. Simple logic. So we set ourselves an ambitious goal of making sure at least 600 million people have an ID before the government changed. Because our view was that 600 million people, who's going to stop this, right? There are too many people on the platform. And very satisfied that we actually reached the 600 million people target in 4.5 years. Less than the 5 years we had said. And when the new government came, there was a lot of media press about Aadhaar getting cancelled and it had become an issue in the elections and all that. But in reality, that was more of rhetoric. I did meet Mr. Modi and talked about the whole thing and explained, and not that he obviously knew the value, but I sort of explained some value aspects. And this government has embraced it and in some sense has put even more weight behind it than earlier. Today, so today I think you can declare it as something that has survived a very major political transition of very different ideologies. Today we have about 96.5 crore people on this platform. So 96.5 crore people. So it will be about 100 crores by March. And I think in the next couple of years, it's implemented in every state. no matter which government is in the state. When there have been government changes in the states also, the program has continued. It's interesting to know that it is not just the Aadhaar, but we also built a cash transfer platform on top of Aadhaar because we wanted to use it for DBT. And today there are 23 crore bank accounts linked to Aadhaar, which is maintained by NPCI, which is huge. That means 23 crore families essentially can receive a direct benefit transfer from the government. And using this direct benefit transfer, so far government has transferred 25,000 crore rupees into individual bank accounts. Now that's a seriously large number, 25,000 crore rupees. So that's established, and it began with the LPG DBT, which we did but now it's being used for pensions, scholarships. Many state governments are using it. I don't know how much in Karnataka, Prasad, you have to tell me, but Ritesh has to tell me what's happening here. But in many states, it's massive. Like Haryana, for example, everything is on Aadhaar now. PDS is on Aadhaar, everything is on Aadhaar. So I think over time, now just to give you an idea of the scale, in LPG alone, the savings last year were 14,000 crores. LPG subsidy savings last year were 12 to 14,000 crores. And the entire program cost us about 8,000 crores. So in other words, for an 8,000 crore investment over 5-6 years, in 1 year, in one program, the savings have been about 12,000 crores. So you can imagine once you apply it to PDS and all of the programs, fertilizer and so on, the savings will be huge, and the recovery of the investment will happen manyfold through that process. The other thing is that, one of the advantages I had was that I would talk to everybody in the system. So I knew more about what was happening than people in the system, because I would talk from the minister to the guy sitting outside the office. I knew everyone. So I was able to essentially sort of go around the system, hang around finance ministry and all kinds of things. So I think that helps. You go and reach out to lots of people, you can get a lot of things done. And a lot of my time was spent fighting tough battles, basically. I mean, one big battle was with the Home Ministry because they felt that UID was encroaching on their territory. So they tried hard to do something about it. But, I had to sort of navigate through that whole thing. Then when I was trying to implement the financial inclusion system, the DFS guys got pretty upset with me, saying, who's this guy meddling in our territory? So I had to sort of go around them, go to RBI and get things done. So basically, you have to sort of navigate through these whole, turf issues, battle issues, hierarchy issues and so on. But I think I was able to get that done because I had a very clear mission to get this done in things. So a few things I learned was that you have to design systems in a very minimal way. If you design systems that are trying to do too many things, then there's enough people who will gang up and make sure it doesn't happen. So you have to make it very simple and make it something that you can scale up very, very quickly. For example, when we designed the enrollment system, we designed it for having any number of enrollment stations that are not connected to each other. So at the peak, we had about 30,000 enrollment stations around the country, all independently enrolling people, and the data was coming to us. So a lot of these things were designed for high scale. We designed a system for 1.5 million enrollments per day, 15 lakh enrollments per day, which is why we were able to reach 96 crores in 5 years. So I think there are many things. I think managing the political economy, managing the bureaucratic turf battles, making sure that it reached a sustainable size before the government changed, convincing everybody about it. When the project began, since the technology was taking about 14 months to develop, I went to every state and I met every chief minister to talk about this project so that I got the buy-in. So I went and met Raman Singh in Chhattisgarh and Nitish Kumar in Bihar and Tarun Gogoi in Assam, and everybody. I mean, the only one who didn't meet me was Mayawati because she was incognito somewhere. I don't know where she was. But so I had a policy of going and meeting the chief ministers in their state capital so that they felt that I was coming to them and they were not, I was not making them come to me. And I even had a policy that if a chief minister was in Delhi, I would go and meet him in his bhavan and not make him come to my office. So let's say, once I was meeting Mr. Sushil Modi, who at that time was the deputy CM of Bihar and the finance minister. So I went to Bihar Bhavan to meet him. So the idea was that to show respect by saying, I'm coming to your office to meet you. So simple things like that. I was able to get a lot of buy-in across the system. And then I had to convince all the banks to become part of this. I had to convince the oil companies. I had to convince the fertilizer companies. So it was really a massive evangelizing job of going to every stakeholder and making them part of the system. So anyway, so I think it was a good experience being in the government system. So that was, I'll come back. Maybe in the Q&A I'll talk about that. So let me talk about the second part of my presentation, is what does this do and why is it so strategic and why is it so disruptive, both to governance and to business. I think let me talk a bit about that. And that I'll do through a set of slides. So we call this set of, this thing that has been built as the India Stack. And we're using the word India Stack. And I'm happy to say that we talk about how to make transactions presence-less, paperless, and cashless. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. I'm happy to say that there's a governance group. I don't know that you guys know, but there are some 8 groups formed by the Prime Minister to come back with big ideas on governance. So one of the groups is the governance group. And the governance group made a presentation to the Prime Minister 3 days back, where they said we are going to build all our applications to be presence-less, cashless, and paperless. So at least now this language has become embedded in the system of doing things. So what is that? What's happening? Again, I think the PM and the FM has talked about JAM, which is the foundation of the India Stack. JAM stands for Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile. Jan Dhan is Jan Dhan Yojana, which is the government's program for financial inclusion to make sure that everybody has a bank account. So that means everybody possessing a bank account. Aadhaar is the Aadhaar number, which is a unique online ID for everyone. And mobile is mobile, the phone. And the philosophy is that if everybody has a bank account, if everybody has an identity, Aadhaar, and if everybody has a mobile phone, then with these 3 things, you can dramatically change the way you deliver public services and the way you do a business. So both are going to get impacted by JAM. So JAM is a foundation. Now in Jan Dhan, as you know, about 19 crore accounts have been opened. This is on top of all the accounts opened earlier. And so that continues to be a push. A lot of those accounts are inactive. Now they're trying to make them active. But fundamentally, accounts will get opened because if you convert everything to cash transfer, then you need an account in which you credit the money. So we think that this is going to happen because of the accounts opening. This is coming from government push. The way this happened was some JS and DFS kept having weekly meetings on video conference with all the public sector banks to make them open accounts. However, another important thing is happening at the same time, which is regulatory innovation by the Reserve Bank of India. If you get a history of banking in India, we had 14 banks nationalized in 1969 when Indira Gandhi first came back to power, and 6 banks in 1980. So 20 banks became nationalized. All the so-called PSU banks, Canara Bank, Vijaya Bank, Indian Overseas Bank, Indian Bank, were all essentially private banks that got nationalized. From 1980 to 1993, no banks were opened in India. No private banks were opened in India because it was prohibited. In 1993, after the first liberalization, one of the liberalization was to bring in new private sector banks. So there was the finance ministry came out with regulations for new private banks, and that led to banks like ICICI Bank, HDFC Bank, IDBI Bank, and so on. So in many cases, these were development financial institutions, DFIs, which got converted to banks like ICICI Bank. In many cases, there were new banks like Centurion Bank, which got merged with Bank of Punjab, which got merged with Centurion Bank, which got bought by HDFC, Times Bank, and so on. And then in 2001, 2 more bank licenses were given. That was again given to Yes Bank and Kotak Bank. So these are the 2 banks. And then in 2014, 2 more banks were given licenses, IDFC Bank and Bandhan Bank from Calcutta. So fundamentally, if you look at it, in 49 years, only 14 banks got bank licenses. In the last 6 months, the RBI has given 21 bank licenses. So what didn't happen in 49 years has happened in 6 months. Because the RBI came out with a very clever idea of doing something called differentiated banking. In other words, they said if giving a full license is too much, but let's give banks with a specific purpose. And they came out with 2 categories of banks. One is called a payment bank, which can only do payments and take deposits, but can't lend. So it's more like a transaction bank. And the second kind of bank is called a small bank, where there are limits on the size of loans you can give, small ticket loans. And 11 people have been given a license to have a small bank. 3 of them are from Bangalore, Ujjivan, Janalakshmi, and there's one more. And payment bank is given to telecom companies and all that. So fundamentally, there is a massive thing happening with 21 banks now coming. So the combination of Jan Dhan pushing from the government side and the competitive intensity unleashed by 21 banks which are being licensed means that it's fairly clear that in the next 3 to 4 years, everybody will have some kind of an account. And we have seen that with wallets. Today, if you look at wallets, wallets was introduced by the Reserve Bank because the banks were not ready to open bank accounts. They wanted, mobile payments and all that. And today, the largest of the wallet companies, Paytm, has 100 million, 10 crore wallets. They're much bigger. The transaction volume of Paytm today is bigger than HDFC, which is the largest bank. So all these innovations can dramatically improve the depth. So you can assume that in the next 4 to 5 years, everybody having a bank account or a wallet of some kind is a reasonable expectation. Now, Aadhaar, I explained, it's at 965 billion, going up to 1 billion. But what's important also is that I explained its use in the banking system to put money. So 25,000 crores has been put into people's bank accounts using this. But it's also a way to withdraw money. And for that, we designed something called a micro ATM, where a grocery store in a village can have a device on which he can put his thumb and withdraw his money. And there are already 79,000 micro ATMs have been deployed. And our goal was to have 1 million of these micro ATMs. And you can also use Aadhaar for opening a bank account. So you can just put your finger and open a bank account using what's called eKYC, or Electronic Know Your Customer. And 1.7 crore bank accounts have been opened using eKYC. So that's not small, that's quite a large number. So this stuff is now a thing. And there are many other users. I mean, today the biometric attendance system is being used for at least 300,000 government employees at minimum. I think it's much more than that. And once the railways and the defense start using it, it will climb. And they say that's the reason why Modi lost Delhi, because he introduced biometric attendance system. And then there is the whole expansion of phones. See, India has 1 billion phones, but these are mostly feature phones. But the important thing which is happening is the rise of smartphones. And currently, India has about 150 to 200 million smartphones, growing at the rate of 25 million smartphones a quarter. So we're looking at adding 100 million or 10 crore smartphones a year. So by 2020, you can expect anywhere from 50 crore to 70 crore smartphones. And smartphone prices are falling. Today, you can get a decent smartphone for 5,000 to 6,000 rupees. In 2 years' time, you will get a very good smartphone for 3,000 rupees. So over time, there's going to be if you look at the sales this year, 250 million phones sold. The number of smartphones sold is about 100 million, and the number of feature phones sold is maybe 150 million. So already that by next year, it will be more smartphones sold, and then the whole thing will tip over. So look at it, assume that 1 out of every 2 persons will have a smartphone. Recently, we launched this Ek Step across UP, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh. In every village, we saw at least 4 to 5 smartphones. 4 to 5 smartphones in every village, and they call it as a WhatsApp phone because, they get free SMS on WhatsApp. So all this led to what we call as the India stack. So in other words, Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile is the foundation. But with that foundation, you can do authentication. So authentication, the biometric attendance system is an example of authentication. Now the advantage of authentication is that you can make it presence-less. In other words, I can verify the identity of a person without him being physically present in front of you. That's what we mean by presence-less. Why is this important? Because when we design processes, we ask people to come to the office for this, that, and the other. Tomorrow, somebody can confirm who they are electronically on a phone, wherever they are. And that's called presence-less. So the entire way we govern or the way we do business can change by making things presence-less. A good example is, I don't know whether any of the retired folks are using it, it's called Jeevan Praman. And Jeevan Praman is an application for the life certificate, right? So every year you have to go and say, I'm alive, so that your pension doesn't stop. Now, historically, this was done by going to a government department or whatever. Today, I can just use an Aadhaar authentication and do life certificate. So if I'm somebody, and somebody can, tomorrow there'll be a service, somebody will come with a mobile phone to your house, do an authentication, charge a fee, and that becomes a life certificate. So look at the convenience now. Millions of pensioners, some of them may not be in a position to even walk and so on. Somebody can come to their home, do the life certificate. So this is presence-less. He doesn't have to physically go and show, he or she doesn't have to go and show their face somewhere. So presence-less is fundamental to reforming the way we deliver services. Second thing is things like the electronic KYC. We have something called e-sign, which allows you to sign a digital signature on an electronic document, or the locker system, which allows you to store documents, allows you to do things paperless. In other words, you can build a completely paperless system where I enter something on a phone and it gets stored electronically, I can retrieve it electronically, fully secure. So paperless is hugely important. It reduces costs and makes everything paperless. And then there's something I'll talk about called cashless. So Aadhaar, we know, it's a unique number authentication. I can use either a finger or an iris. Now, the latest smartphones have iris cameras. So I can use my phone, and in fact, if you have an iPhone, the iPhone Touch is a biometric. This is a biometric reader. So I can click on something and do a verification, or I can look at something, click, and do a verification. So authentication becomes very simple. So it basically answers the question, yes, no, anytime, anywhere. The eKYC allows paperless account opening. Now, I can do eKYC not just for banking. I can do it for a passport. I can do it for a driver's license. I can do it for a PDS ration card or whatever. So electronically, I can open things with online verification. So the way it works is, you enter your Aadhaar number and say, I want to open a bank account. I put your finger, and the Aadhaar system releases the name and address to the bank. So everything happens electronically in Manivan, fashionably late. Come, Manivan. Then e-sign allows you to sign documents with Aadhaar, which means I can just put my finger and sign a document, which is very important. For example, when you have a registration system, you can just sign documents electronically. So wet signatures are not required. I don't have to sign with a pen. I can sign electronically. Again, that becomes paperless. You can combine eKYC with e-sign. And then we have a complete system which is being rolled out by the Department of Electronics, which allows you to keep these documents anywhere electronically, but very secure because it's all signed and encrypted. I'll give an example. We can use this system for all degree certificates. Today we have all this fake degree problem, all that. Tomorrow, if you graduate from college, the college can sign your degree certificate and store it in a repository and send you the address. And when you go for a job interview, instead of carrying some photocopy and all that, you can just say, take my documents from this location, and that location is non-repudiable, which means that you can prove that it came from the original college. So the whole thing becomes a very strong system. So all this is to make it paperless. So, if you're looking at your entire land record system or whatever, you can use all this stuff. And then there's a very important thing which is coming called Unified Payment Interface, which is not from the government so much as from a body called NPCI, which is the National Payment Corporation of India, which is like the Indian Visa or MasterCard based in Bombay. And they have building a mobile-to-mobile interface, which will allow any mobile app to talk to any bank account and do a withdrawal. So this means that on your mobile phone, smartphone, or even a feature phone, you have an app from HDFC Bank, your bank account is in SBI, I can do a debit to my SBI bank account from my HDFC Bank on my phone. So this is a very, very powerful capability, which is getting launched next month. So we're having a launch in Bangalore actually on 13th of February, and a launch in Bombay with the RBI governor on 8th of April. So this will revolutionize mobile payments. Today it's all very fragmented. So this makes it cashless. So Aadhaar makes it presence-less, so I can do a transaction from anywhere. eKYC, eSign and Locker makes it paperless, and this thing, UPI, makes it cashless. So every transaction, a government transaction or a private transaction, can now become paperless, presence-less and cashless. And then we're designing something on top of that, which is how to give consent that you can use my data. Because today, data is a very, very tricky thing. Data is the new oil, as they call it. And the problem we have is that organizations and governments use our data without our permission, which is happening all the time. So before it becomes out of hand, we wanted to implement a data sharing architecture which allows you to approve the use of your data. So this is also something that we are looking at. So this is getting a little complicated here, but fundamentally presence-less with Aadhaar, paperless with KYC and all that, cashless and consent, this provides the infrastructure for redesigning anything. So you can essentially deliver any service on a person's phone. This is very powerful. So I can open a bank account sitting in my house, I can buy an insurance policy, I can buy a mutual fund, I can buy a pension, I can automatically debit my bank account and credit somebody else. All that will now be done through your phone. And this has a dramatic impact on productivity, on convenience, on reducing transaction cost, all these things. So I think this is a very fundamental thing. Essentially, if you look at it, the paperless and presence-less layer is provided by the government of India. Presence-less and eKYC is provided by the Aadhaar system, which is now part of DATI. eSign is provided by the CCA, which is the Digital Certifying Authority, and Digital Locker is provided by DATI. So they're all provided by DATI in some sense, and cashless is provided by the banking system. But all of them together form this very fundamental way. And what's important is that India is the only country which has this stuff. In the West, these are owned by private companies, and therefore they control these things, whereas here we have made it as an open government-created stack. So I talked about LPG. LPG alone does 3 million transactions a day, which means LPG's program does 100 crore transactions a year. And the savings are about 12 to 14,000 crores. What's important is that it's taking the country towards cashless, because now electronically the money is coming to somebody's bank account. Now, once they start making payments with that, then the payment also becomes electronic. So we are starting the journey of going from cashless to cash. Cash to cashless. That's a very important transition. Now, this is a very important structural thing which is happening. Again, has big impact on both government and business, which is that India is going from being data poor to data rich. In other words, we have lots of people, but we have no data. They don't have data about their own, because they're all outside the system. But now when somebody has a smartphone, that smartphone activity is data. If the person pays on his phone, that is data. If the person is on WhatsApp and Facebook or Twitter, that gives some data. And so on. Aadhaar gives data. So India is going from being data poor to data rich in next 3 years. Dramatically. Like, this is huge. Along with that, software is becoming more sophisticated, and there's a whole class of software called machine learning, which is able to look at this data and figure out things in ways that we could not do in the past. So this combination of data rich and machine learning will fundamentally change the way you deliver services. So think about the way we design government systems. Now what we do is we design government systems where we put the barrier of entry at the beginning. So you'll have a process, easy, this, that, all that. The moment you put the selection process at the beginning, then you're creating impediment, getting the people into the system. Inclusion becomes a problem. What you can now do is you can keep the barrier of entry low and use data to find out if somebody is not deserving. For example, instead of saying I'll do some BPL list and do my nth BPL survey and all that stuff, you can say, okay, anybody can declare themselves BPL, no problem. But with the data, if you find that you are an income taxpayer, you have a four-wheeler, you have a house, then we'll penalize you. So you switch it around. So make entry barrier low and use data to find defaulters as opposed to creating entry barrier high, which just creates all kinds of problems. So fundamentally we can rethink the way we deliver public services. The other thing is happening is that the phone is becoming the basis for your two-factor authentication. Well, today, is this getting too long? No? Okay. So if you look at when you have a debit card or a credit card, you have a card and a PIN number. So let's say you use your card, right? Your card is your PIN. Your card says, I have a card. It's what you have. And when you go to a restaurant and they make you enter your PIN, that's what you know. And this combination is called two-factor authentication. And the two-factor authentication is required because especially in financial transactions, you want to reduce fraud. So the RBI says that all financial transactions should be two-factor. But now the card is being replaced by the phone. So the phone becomes one factor. And the biometric on the phone is becoming the second factor. So with my phone, I can just press once and I can get two-factor authentication. So now imagine 500 million people with smartphones can do instant transactions just using two-factor authentication on the phone. So this fundamentally changes all these things. So smartphone plus Aadhaar can become one-click two-factor authentication. In fact, we already have this. This is a Samsung phone which has an iris camera. You can just look at the camera and click and your verification is done. And that iris camera cost in the phone is only $2 or $3. It's very cheap. So this can happen at mass scale. Now an example of a use of that is credit. India is an underserved market. India GDP is $2 trillion. Our formal lending system is only $300 billion. So, but in any decent economy, the lending to GDP should be much higher. The problem with that is that our banking system is not designed to give high volume, low cost loans. We tend to look at only collateralized lending. So you give lending against assets, but not lending against working capital or lending against future income. So a lot of underserved markets of the economy. So we think that all these things, especially for the poor, can be done by using systems like this. So we think that a small vendor can, because of the digital trail, get a loan from various people. And she needs a loan, she agrees to share the data, sees loan offers, accepts the offer, receives the loan, gets paid, repays the loan. This whole thing can be an electronic thing on the phone. And so you can suddenly dramatically expand credit, both to consumers as well as to businesses. This is the heart of the economic growth that you can get by dramatically expanding credit using technology. So all this is possible with this infrastructure which I just described. So it's all using, the India stack. So I think what I want to say, I'll end by saying is that it's not just about giving an ID number. The ID number is the beginning of fundamentally transforming delivery of government and business services, because using ID you can build presence-less infrastructure, paperless, cashless, all that. And then over time, as you redesign your systems, you can make them completely different. Now this is important, hugely important. So I think when we talk about governance reform, is about how do we deliver things like this to people on their phones without anyone getting involved and so on. Similarly, in businesses, for example, we did a study for SEBI on the mutual fund business, and we found that in the mutual fund business, it costs 1,500 rupees to get a person to buy a mutual fund, because you have to go and do verification in the house, wet signature, EAO, all kinds of stuff. Now, at 1,500 rupees, the investment size has to be something like, 6 lakhs or 10 lakhs. And only some 3 million households in India can become mutual fund owners. If you can reduce the onboarding cost of getting a mutual fund from 1,500 to 100 rupees, 34 million households can buy mutual fund, because then they can buy a smaller mutual fund. And if you can reduce the onboarding cost to 10 rupees, then 104 million households can buy a mutual fund. So there's a direct correlation between the cost of entering a system and how much access they get. So this is not just some techie stuff. This is fundamentally about inclusion at scale. How to get 1 billion people in the system, formal system, with identity, with savings, with cash transfer, all that. So I think this is a massive thing that is possible with all this stuff. And I hope it will happen in the next 3 to 4 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nandan. Any other questions? So it's open house. Yes,
Just let them introduce themselves.
Yes, Karthik.
Let them introduce.
There's one thing I always wanted to ask.
Can you just introduce yourself?
My name is Karthik. I'm studying BE second year at Ave College. I'm a mechanical engineer. So if you don't mind, this isn't about the topic you spoke about just now. It's somewhat outside. As you know, I always believe that one of the major roadblocks in providing proper service to people, like the government providing proper service, is the tender system.
What?
In public-private partnerships, the tender system, when you're building a road.
Tender system in public-private partnership. Yeah.
So the government has to issue a tender, right? It takes a lot of time. Then they have to verify the people who come. So with your corporate experience and with your experience with Infosys as a developer, as a provider of services, how do you believe that the government can better improve these processes?
Well, there's some role in better systems, procurement standards, procurement platforms, and so on. But I think it's frankly much better to see how we reduce the interface of procurement like that, because I think we have made our procurement systems incredibly complicated. And plus with the kind of obligations on civil servants to be responsible for those decisions for the next 40 years kind of stuff, suddenly you really made it a big mess. So I don't know, there's no simple solution for solving the procurement process in government. You should tell how to do that.
No, I agree with you, but yeah.
Have you given a thought to making elections cashless?
That's not actually. Well, you should read my book. There are 2 chapters on elections. I think political reform is very complicated. In every country today, the cost of conducting elections is going up, or the cost of running. Today, Obama had raised $1 billion in the first election. I don't know how much it is in the second. But in those societies, they have formal systems for doing that. You have facts and all that. Here, it's all informal stuff. So I think it's tough. It requires to be done, but I couldn't see a simple way to solve it. There are many issues, but one of them is the money thing in elections. Yeah, Lakshmi.
Loud enough. Thank you for that wonderful exposition about what I literally see as the flowering of Aadhaar. And I'm sure when you look back 4 to 5 years ago, you must be yourself kind of very amazed at the way in which the dimensions of this initiative keep expanding as you go forward. I just had one question with respect. You know, for me, it's amazing that without the sort of support of a very deliberate policy or even legislation, you managed to drive this through. You know, it was predicated on partnerships, on private sector being a very important driver of the change that you were seeing, and on a very inclusive approach overall. So how do you sort of react to the current debate on the need for legislation to sort of have this, I mean, do you see this as a positive requirement?
Legislation for?
For Aadhaar.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, I think obviously we need a legislation to embed this in the system. But when we began, why? Well, first of all, you need to create a regulatory framework, because as more and more people use this, dispute resolution, this, that, liability, all those kind of things. Also, I think we needed to get the Supreme Court out of this business, because as long as there is no legislation, then there will be a number of Supreme Court issues, and you know, our courts today decide everything for us. So they will say you can use it here, not use it there, or something like that. So I think we need to remove that ambiguity from that. But when we started the project, we made sure that we had complete opinion that what we are doing was absolutely legal. I got opinion from the CAG saying that this was absolutely fine. So we made sure we covered all that. But I think a law will help to just, you know, eliminate this confusion about all this ambiguity and this court interference and those kind of things. And a law should be possible, because the law was introduced by the previous government. Now, I'm hoping that they will support anything that they bring. But the other possibility that I'm told they're contemplating is bringing it as a money bill. You know, the new fashion in town is money bill, because only Lok Sabha has to pass the money bill. So I don't know what is going to happen.
People. So over the next 5 to 10 years, what are the mega trends, social, economic, cultural, which would emanate from this? And would that change come about regardless of anything else? Can it be speeded? Can it be slowed down by other things which the government is doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think these trends are on anyway. I think in some cases government has played a role, obviously, by, for example, enabling a telecom infrastructure. But now it's going to take off, right? A lot of them are enabled by technology. Technology is going to drive prices lower, right? So the smartphone will drop to 3,000 rupees, not because of government, but some guy in China is building a phone using an OS from London and a chip from California. I mean, that's going to happen. So I think cheaper smartphones, broadband will get better, because so much investment is going on to make technology give more and more powerful broadband. Internet connectivity will become ubiquitous. One of the big things which is happening in India, which people are not recognizing, is what I call as the offline internet. You think offline internet sounds like, what is it? Internet is online, so you're sounding, you know, like an oxymoron. But India has come up with this unique model of using internet offline, which means that people are not connected all the time. So for example, Google changed their YouTube to offer offline YouTube. So you go to YouTube, you want to download some video, you can download, you know, some Bahubali trailer or something. You can download that into your smartphone, then you can be disconnected and you can still see it. So I can now see video offline. Obviously I can listen to music offline. I can read material like ebooks offline. Google Maps is now offline. So I can download a map of Bangalore and then I can navigate without connecting to the Google map. So offline usage in India is a unique phenomenon, because two reasons. One is the data connectivity is not there everywhere. And second, people are very conscious of data consumption. They don't want to consume their data packs. So today, for example, Google and the railways have announced they're going to have 400 railway stations with Wi-Fi, half an hour free. So now what's going to happen is people are going to go for that half an hour free, go to Bombay Central Railway Station, download some 10 movies and push off and watch Aram Se. So all these are behavior patterns that nowhere else in the world, and it's going to happen. So I think some of those things, the ubiquitous use of smartphones, the offline internet, all that is just going to happen whether nobody's going to be, it's not based on anybody anywhere. So mega trends caused by technology and these social disruptions and the aspirations. You know, we just launched this Ek-Step Reading Week in these Madhya Pradesh and all these states. Massive children coming from all over because they want to learn how to read. So the aspirations of people will meet this thing. So I think that's where the action is.
Mr. Neil, most utopian, considering the present way in which most of our institutions function. We have the backing, we have the technological expertise, we have the people who can do these things, yet things don't happen on the ground. So I'm a little fearful that if we introduce too much technology into these things, we will fall down somewhere. Now,
it can't get worse.
But I'll just finish this. My first question, of course, was nothing to do with what I said now. It's a question of a very simple-minded, computer non-savvy person. And that is that why were we not issued with any cards? We were issued that sort of a letter with a number on it on a piece of paper, which gives you your UID number.
Aadhaar number.
Yeah, Aadhaar number. But no card. And we were all told that there's no need for a card because there's no need for you to present or swipe your card anywhere or anything like that. Maybe you can explain that a little more. But that's not a basic issue against the system. The third and most important thing is that a lot of functionaries are expected to do a great job with all the various steps that you have told me. Now, I, for one, maybe I'm in the IAS one of the few really illiterate people in that sense, but many of us are fearful of going to a computer and doing something and something going wrong in the system. And I have a fear that there can be misuse of the system by people who know much more than we do. All the wrongdoers seem to know much more about computers than we do. So what are the protective steps you are taking? And lastly, I'm sorry to bundle so many things into one question. Lastly, many people in India, to give them due credit, they are very savvy in their own way, but many people are not literate in the sense of reading and writing. So this huge Aadhaar system, which calls for even the lowest level person to understand what is to be done in order to go through it and secure whatever benefit he is aiming for. What is the system of training or learning that you envisage? Because I feel that this has to be a big part of the program, not just announcing that these things can be done. If you press this, you'll get that. If you press that, you press that. No, but tell them how to go about it. And that's a major learning process, which I hope will be undertaken.
No, I think very valid points. As far as the first question is concerned, we had to, first of all, we had a budget constraint. If you're going to issue 100 crore people a card, every rupee I spend extra costs 100 crores. So we had to keep it simple. And basically the cost of the card, paper is actually 2 rupees, which was a per capita cost. What people do is they cut it out and laminate it and keep it. So that's the way we thought about it. The real value is the number on the system. The number is what matters. Number goes into your bank account, the number goes here. So the number is the long-term value. And many people are actually doing a business where they issue an upgraded card to you with your number. So there are a lot of ways to solve that problem. Because if you had gone from 2 rupees to 20 rupees, that would have been 2,000 crores. And when you're fighting battles with the Department of Expenditure, fairly well done. Certainly far more secure than many other systems around. So I think, but that's always a risk in this. In terms of the illiteracy, and we are finding that when people see a value, they use it. I mean, today 1 billion Indians have 1 billion phones around. People know how to go and do a recharge. They can go to a village grocery store, give 5 rupees and get a data pack. Today in Narega, we are doing, I don't know, at least a few lakh transactions, at least 10 to 20 lakh transactions a month of people withdrawing money from their account using Aadhaar. There is no literacy involved. There is no exactly. They go to the PC, put their finger, authenticate, ask for the money, and go. So I think, I think we're underestimating people's ability to use these technologies. I gave you the example of this offline internet. Only in India you will have a thing called offline internet, where people are going to some Wi-Fi, downloading some movie, going home, then they are reselling that. Yeah, no, there's a market here. No, there is a market where the guy will come to the railway station, use his half-an-hour Wi-Fi, download some music and songs, go back to his village and resell it. It's happening today. That day there was a plane crash at Dwarka, that CPRF plane, or CRPF.
CRPF.
Somebody did a video of that plane crash and was selling it for 10 rupees. This is what is happening, So I think I'm quite comfortable that people will figure out.
Mr. Kedar. Now, with my experience with ESIC card, now what is the proportion of verification of iris versus finger areas?
Yeah.
What is the proportion of iris?
No, iris is much more reliable than fingerprint.
What is the verification rate today?
No, I think in fingerprint, the verification is about 95%, if it's a properly configured system. Iris is about 99%.
No. When authentication happens, as of now, how many people?
How many are using iris?
Yes.
Not many, because the iris-based devices, they're not enough in the field.
Because in the field, my worry was that fingerprints.
Yeah, that's why we built it with both iris and fingerprint, though we had a big battle with the Home Ministry on this point. But anyway, we built it with iris and fingerprint, because we think it will become mass market.
Thank you. It was an inspiring talk, and it's people like you who build this country. Thank you so much.